I was standing at the immigration department at Lod Airport. You know, before they used to have the biometric passports, you actually had to present your passport to somebody. And I gave my passport, this ancient British passport, to this lady behind the counter. And she picked up the passport and she read the name on the passport, John, John Sinclair. Not a very Jewish name. So she looks at me, and I'm, pretty much dressed the same way I was dressed now, standard Haredi outfit. So she looks at me, John Sinclair. She picks up the passport. She opens up the passport, and she turns it to the picture page. Now, on the picture in this passport is this picture of this jet-setting Hollywood record producer with this very, very Douglas Fairbanks moustache and a very, very self-satisfied look on his face, something like this. So she looks at the picture, she looks up at me, she looks down again at the picture, she looks up at me. She closes the passport, and with this sigh, which mixes tremendous sympathy and total bewilderment, she says, "What happened?" So I replied to her with 2 words in Yiddish. Now, I don't know a lot of Yiddish, but 2 words in Yiddish I do know. I said to her, "Pintele Yid." She said, "Ma?" Apparently her Yiddish was about as extensive as mine was. So I translated for her into Ivrit Modernit, modern Hebrew. I said, "Netzotz HaYehudi," which in English translates as the Jewish spark. Chazal teach us that inside every Yid, there's a little Pintele Yid, a little Jewish spark, and really that's the story of Hanukkah. And that spark goes on burning and burning and burning and burning, and it never ever goes out. 40 years ago, I was working as a record producer in London, in New York, in Los Angeles, and if you told me then that 40 years later, I would be standing here this afternoon speaking to you now, I would change my manager. How did I get from Hollywood to the Holy Land? Well, as a kid, I always wanted to be an actor. Now, to be an actor is not a very easy thing, because to be an actor, you have to have what's called an equity card, a union ticket. But to have an equity card, you have to have a job. But to have a job, you have to have an equity card. So I managed to get myself out of this catch-22 situation by auditioning for a show, a musical, that you've probably never heard of, called Hair. So Hair was this big musical back in the late 60s, 70s, and it had been a big hit on Broadway, and they brought it to London, and now they were going to tour it around the provinces of England. And they were looking for 3 casts, one in London, one to go on a tour, and the other one to be up in Glasgow. Each one of these casts, the show consisted of about 30 boys and girls between the ages of about 18 and 27, who could all sing, dance, and act. Well, I could sing, I could act, and as I put on my resume, I could move well. I managed to move well enough to get myself a job in this cast, the touring cast of Hair, and I spent the next 6 months touring around the provinces in England, Birmingham, Leeds, Manchester, Bristol, and I can promise you, for a so-called glamorous profession, it's extremely boring. But what's the most important part? Everybody's on a play here, right? Everybody's been in a play. What's the most important part of a play? Script? Rehearsal, right? It's a bit like baking a cake. What you don't put into the oven doesn't come out of the oven. What you don't put into rehearsal doesn't come out on opening night. But once you've had your opening night, and you had your second night, and your third night, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, you're doing 7 shows a week. 7 shows a week. You're doing 5 nights and 2 matinees. And it's the same thing, 3 hours of the same thing, over and over and over and over again. And, you're in some provincial city, you have no family there, you have no friends there. You've seen every movie in town about 3 times, so what do? You spend tremendous hours, long hours sitting in coffee bars, drinking vast amounts of coffee. I had a friend in the cast, and we used to spend a lot of time sitting in those coffee bars, and we discussed 3 things. The first of those three things was musicals. Obviously, we were in a musical. We used to talk about how far could you push the edges of the envelope? How far could you push a musical and it would still be, acceptable? The second thing we used to talk a lot about was rock and roll. We both loved rock and roll. Now, I'm not talking about the sort of rubbish they play on the radio nowadays. I'm talking about the original stuff, Chuck Berry. The other thing we used to talk a lot about was science fiction movies. We were both big fans of those early black and white 50s science fiction movies. Now, of course, not the sort of science fiction movies that you can see nowadays where the special effects budget was marginally larger than the gross national product of Peru last year. I'm talking about the sort of science fiction movies where they spend about 25 cents on this ridiculous throbbing green beach ball that sort of terrorizes Gotham City. We love these terrible old, cranky, hokey science fiction films. So I remember we were sitting together in a coffee bar, I think it was in Leeds, and this idea dropped into my head. I said, Richard, why hasn't anybody written a science fiction, rock and roll musical? He looked at me and said, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. Let's do it. So we sat down that afternoon and we started to write this musical. And we had the opening scene, we had an idea that this be sort of this beautiful classic Midwestern wedding, the bride and the groom and the confetti and the white fence work in the back. And they drive off into the beautiful sunset. And of course, the dark would fall and then there would be this terrible torrential rainstorm, millions of gallons of water pouring onto the set care of the Los Angeles fire department, and the car would break down. There they were, stuck in the middle of nowhere, and the groom would turn to the bride and say, didn't we pass the castle back down the road? Anyway, before we got too far with this musical, I had to leave the cast of Hair. Hair was a very, very tough show to do for the actors because it was designed originally as a studio production, something that would be run for about 6 weeks and then close. And so what you can ask an actor to do with his body for 6 weeks, you can't do that for 6 months. For example, there was this thing we used to do, and I'm sure it looked great, where the entire cast, you can imagine 30 people, all walking down stage, and we would all together as one person fall to our knees. And it looked amazing, but I don't think the Ribono Shel Olam had this quite in mind while designing the human knee. And so after 6 months of what we called knee acting, my right knee swelled up to the size of that beach ball and I had to leave the cast of Hair. I went back down to London and to cut a very long story short, I got involved in building a recording studio. This recording studio turned out to be the first 24-track recording studio in Europe. Everybody was 16-track at the time. We had the new technology and of course people were, interested to try it out, but we hadn't had a hit record. Now, a recording studios stand or fall on the hits that come out of them. If you're a studio which has a hit record, great. If you don't, you're another studio. Well, our hit came along in a rather unusual fashion. There was a band working in town at the time who were working on their new single, and they were working in another studio called Trident Studios, which was 16-track. Basically, the more tracks you have, the more flexibility you can have. They were working on this very, very complicated song. And quite simply, they ran out of tracks. So they had to come to us. We were the only 24-track studio in Europe. And they came and they put up this, and this was going to be their new single, and they put up this big 2-inch tape back in the day, and we could hear from the controller and what this thing sounded like. We were shocked. This thing sounded like an opera. You see, back in the day then, when the BBC decided exactly what would be played and wouldn't be played, the BBC decided that a pop record was 2 minutes, 43 and a half seconds in 4/4 time. That's it, very, very tight. This record was about 4 minutes long. The key was all over the place. The key changed every 30 seconds. The timing, the rhythm was all over the place. It sounded nothing more or less than an opera. We said, these guys are crazy. It'll never get played by the BBC. And if it doesn't get played by the BBC, it's not going to be a hit. How wrong we were. The song was a song called Bohemian Rhapsody. The band was a band called Queen. And after that, we could have basically sold the studio time for about 25 hours a day, bottled the air, walked up into the street and sold the air as well. Nothing succeeds like success. Okay, so after having this big hit record mixed in my recording studio, we started to get offers of, really great top-line bands to produce. So I'm standing in the control room one day, and this guy comes on the line with this fake American accent. And he says to me, oh, hi. I heard you're a real good producer. I got this band. They're going to be number one. So I think to myself, who is this? Is this a joke or something? We're going to fly you over. He said, we're going to fly you over to New York City. We're going to get you a limousine from the airport to your hotel. We're going to get you a limousine from the hotel to your room. We're going to get you a limousine from the room to the kitchen. We're going to get you a limousine to the limousine to the limousine. I thought, this is a joke. Who's putting me on here? It took me about 2 minutes into this conversation to realize, no, this is actually a real offer, a real band, and a real accent. And before I could say Jack Robinson, there I am standing in SIR rehearsal studios in Manhattan watching these guys tuning up their instruments, and I think to myself, what if these guys can't play? Nobody actually heard a note of music. Well, they struck up the first 4 bars of a song, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I said to myself, Baruch Hashem. Well, I would have said Baruch Hashem had I known to say it at the time. Baruch Hashem, a hit record, and it was a hit. The song was a song called Cold as Ice. The band was a band called Foreigner. And that first album by Foreigner, there's another song called Feels Like the First Time. That first debut album by Foreigner went on to sell 5 million records. Baruch Hashem. Around this time, I get a phone call from my erstwhile writing partner, Richard. He says to me, John, what's happening? Are you a record producer? Are you a studio owner? Or are you a writer? What's happening with the play? So I said, Richard, no way I can write a play, no way I can write a musical. You go ahead, you write the musical. And you know something? If it comes to anything, let's set up a music publishing company specifically to publish the rights to the music. And so he went ahead and he finished it off. And it became rather successful. I don't know if you have ever heard of it. It was something called the Rocky Horror Picture Show. So there I was back in 1976. I've got a 4 million platinum album, 5 millions by now, but 4 million at the time, 4 platinum albums neatly lined up there on my mother's living room wall. I've got, the first 24-track studio in Europe. I've got a 4 million selling, I've got this Mulliner, I've got the hit publisher, the music publishing of one of the biggest hit musicals of the decade. I've got this Mulliner fastback Bentley Continental car. It's about 3/4 of a block long, pure aluminium body. They only made 150 of them. Inside is this beautiful beige and burgundy upholstery that 15 cows have had to die for. In front of you, there's this dashboard, which is this beautiful veneer, pure mahogany veneer. You can't tell any difference between the left and the right. In the middle is this limited edition Smith's clock ticking away, analog clock ticking away, ticking away. I promise you this car is so quiet, you can hear the minutes of your life ticking away, ticking away. And I'm driving around town and they're looking at me, and I'm looking at them and they're looking at me, and I'm eating steak for lunch and steak for dinner and steak for breakfast and steak for steak. And I think to myself, is that all there is? Is that all there is? This is what people go crazy for? This is what people are trying to, claw to get to that. This is almost to claw each other. This is it. In life, when you have a failure, if there's anybody in this room who never failed at anything, please come and speak to me afterwards. Everybody knows what it means to have a failure. You open up the envelope with your exam results. Right? The elevator plummets through the pit of your stomach. You blew it. But when you're a success and you have everything that everybody wants, everything, and you still feel, so I didn't know what to do. I made the following calculation. I thought to myself, you know something? You're never going to be happy as a record producer. You're never going to be happy as a music publisher. You're never going to be happy as a studio owner. You need to get back to your original love, acting. So pretty much on the spot, I did an about turn. I left the music business I flew out to California, I got myself an agent, and I started to work as an actor. I did the first episode of what's it called, Moonlighting. I did the thing with Sigourney Weaver called Half Moon Street. And I start to get the same feeling. Now I'm really in trouble, because this was what I thought was going to make me feel fulfilled. At this point, I read a book, actually 2 books, one book within the other. One book, if you like, was the fruit, and the other was the shell, the klipa. Let's start with the shell, the klipa. The shell was a novel by a famous Yiddish author that sat on my bookshelf in Los Angeles, in Hollywood, for about 1.5 years until I finally took it and I read it on a beach in a place called Cabo San Lucas in Baja California. Now, for those of you who don't know, Cabo San Lucas is the place where, when the pressure of doing nothing in Hollywood gets too much for you, go down to Cabo San Lucas and do nothing down there instead. I took this book, I read it on the beach, and it hit me between the eyes like a juggernaut. It was a brilliant novel. The novel was a novel about a Baal Tshuva. Not the kind of Bali Tshuvas that we know of today, somebody who's never seen Tefillin, never seen Shabbos. This was a book about a real Baal Tshuva. Someone who'd grown up in a little shtetl in Europe before the war, and when the Nazis, Yamach Shemam V'Zichram, rolled over this little Jewish shtetl, and they herded all the Jews into this small wooden shul. They herded them in there, and then the stormtroopers run in with these mattresses and kerosene, and they throw the mattresses onto the bima, and they light up the kerosene, and the whole thing goes up like a tinderbox. And the screams that are coming out of this shul. And there's a little teenage boy there who's very agile, very nimble. And he climbs up and up and up and up and up. And he manages to get to the ladies' gallery. And then from the ladies' gallery, he climbs up right to a skylight in the roof. He gets out, he runs away, he gets to Danzig, he gets on a boat. He gets himself to New York City. In New York City, he turns his back on the Rebbeinu Shel Olam, on everything. He doesn't want to know anything about anything. Turns his back on everything. And he makes a new life for himself. Many, many years later, he's in a bookshop and he turns to his left and he sees there's a girl standing there and he recognizes her. She too was escaped from that village. And they look at each other and they recognize each other. They meet again after so many years. And they fall in love, and they get married. She, Nebuch, also has completely turned her back on Yiddishkeit. They meet, they fall in love, they get married in a totally secular way. And unfortunately, as so often happens in those kinds of relationships, after the initial gloss wears off and the boredom starts to set in, I don't think I need to go into too many details as to what started to happen. The hero of this novel comes back one lunchtime from work. He never comes back at lunchtime, pulls out the key from his door, puts the key in the lock, he opens up the door, and in front of him there's a sight that he cannot believe what's been going on. He stands there transfixed by this terrible apparition for a few seconds, and then he runs into the apartment, he runs into the bedroom, he opens up a closet, he rummages around the closet for an old suit where he knows he has a few $100s stashed away, grabs the money, stuffs it into his pockets, runs out of the apartment, he runs down the 30 flights of stairs all the way to the ground floor, he runs out of the apartment building, he's running, he doesn't know where he's running, he's just running away. And he runs all the way down to the Lower East Side of New York City, where all the Jews came off the boats from Europe. And as he's running down this little side street, down there on the Lower East Side, someone steps out of a little shtibel, a little shul, and calls out, "At center, someone needs to say Kaddish for their father." And they can't find a 10th man. And literally, as he's running down the street, they pull him off the street. And he's standing there and he hears, "Yizgadel v'yizgadei shemei rabo. V'olama divrachi usei v'yamlich malchusei. B'chayei choy. U'v'yoymei choy. U'v'chayei d'chol beis Yisrael. Bagolov is man Karev, and his heart shatters inside him. He stands himself, it's fine, tears pouring down his face. He hasn't heard Kaddish in 23 years. And he stands there for a very long time. Everybody else leaves the shul. Finally gets himself together, pulls himself together. He leaves the shul. He walks a few yards down the street, and then he turns and he finds himself looking in the window of a Jewish bookshop. In the window of that Jewish bookshop, my friends, was a book called Mesilas Yesharim, The Path of the Just, by Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, Zecher Tzadik B'Kodesh Livrocha, who lived in Italy and died here in Yerushalayim some 290 years ago. And as he sees this book behind the window, he goes into the shop, takes the book in his hands, he cradles it between his hands. He goes over to the cashier, he pays for the book, goes out into the street, he hails down a taxi cab, he says, take me to the airport, take me to Kennedy. He buys a ticket, he gets on a plane, flies to Eretz Yisrael. He gets off the plane, he says, take me to the Koisel. And they drive up the ancient hills of Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, to get to the Koisel. He gets out of the taxi cab, and he walks up to those ancient hallowed stones, and as he's approaching the Koisel, his whole life starts to flash in front of him. And he's standing there crying his eyes out for his life. And somebody walks up and taps him on the shoulder and he says, Are you Jewish? And he says, Yes. Yes, I'm Jewish. And he says, would you like to come for Shabbos? And he says, yes, I think I would. I think I would. And he leads him through the streets of Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, B'Leil Shabbos. Anybody who's done this knows what I'm talking about. You walk right down the middle of a major road, right down the middle. You do this any other time of the week, you'll be instantly mown down by a number 4 bus. But now there's nothing there. And the odor of diesel fumes has been replaced by the aroma of Shabbos cooking, wafting on the cool night air. And he's led into this beautiful, humble home. And the light that shone off that Shabbos table, I was fascinated by this novel that I'd read down there in Capo San Lucas. I got off that beach, I flew back to Los Angeles, I went down to Pico Fairfax. I was fascinated. What was this book, the Mesilas Yesharim, The Path of the Just, that had such a powerful effect on the hero of this novel? So I went down there, I bought a copy of Mesilas Yesharim with an English translation, because my Hebrew skills were, to put it mildly, rather limited at the time. Mesilas Yesharim became my bedtime reading for the next 3 months. Now, if you know anything about Mesilas Yesharim, you'll find that an extremely amusing statement, because Mesilas Yesharim is nobody's idea of a bedtime book. Mesilas Yesharim is an extremely difficult sefer. You know why it's so difficult? Because as the author himself says, you're going to find nothing in this book that you didn't already know before. And my friends, that is the most difficult kind of knowledge to actualize and make part of our lives, because all of us are born with certain innate knowledge of what it is that we're supposed to be doing in this world. We're born with that. Very early on in our lives, that innate knowledge, we take it and we toss it into this lead-lined chamber at the back of our head. We slam the door, spin the wheel, spin the padlocks, and there that essential life information will stay till the day we die, until we make an effort to get back into that lead-lined box. The Mesilas Yesharim is the way you get into that lead-lined box. In fact, if you think about it, Mesilas Yesharim really isn't a book at all. It's a blowtorch. It's a blowtorch that gets you into that lead-lined box, that safe room, unsafe room at the back of your brain. But of course, like a blowtorch, it doesn't work all at once. Like a blowtorch, you have to keep going at it and going at it and going at it and going at it. And similarly, with Mesilas Yesharim, the only way we'll get anything out of it is to keep reading it and reading it and reading it and reading it. And eventually, you'll get in there. You'll get into that room in the back of your head where all that essential life information is stored. I didn't know anything about this. I read Mesilas Yesharim as a bedtime book. Is there any more superficial reading than a bedtime book? When you read a book at bedtime, you don't want to read the book, you want to fall asleep. And yet, if I had to point to one moment on my journey between Hollywood and the Holy Land, where suddenly the compass flipped 180 degrees, that was it. Reading Mesilas Yesharim. I strongly recommend that you learn Mesilas Yesharim, or better still, find somebody to learn it with. It'll change your life. Okay, so that was the fruit. That was the book within the book, the pre. But what about the shell? What about the klipa? What about the novel? Now put yourself in my position. You're living in Hollywood, right? And you've read this brilliant novel. What would you do? Share it. More than that? What? Look more into it. Make a show out of it. Make a movie out of it. Right? You're living in Hollywood. It's all going on there. Everybody's talking about, treatments and novel and scripts. And I got this one, and this is being read by Warner Brothers. So anyway, I picked up the phone. I managed to find out who the agent was for this well-known Yiddish author. And I found that the rights were still available. And I started to get into a conversation about the possibility of taking out an option on this novel. And I thought to myself, hang on a second, this is the big time. Maybe you should just do a little bit of research and see if this thing has what they call in Hollywood legs. Is it going to go anywhere? I bought 9 copies of this novel. I gave them out to 9 people whose opinions I trusted implicitly. I said to each of them, read this book, I'm calling you back in a week. I want to know, is this a movie? I called them all back in a week. Their unanimous reply was the equivalent of, So I don't know if this novel was ever made into a movie. I don't think it ever was. But in a rather strange way, rather than make the movie, I became the movie. Scene 1, Copenhagen, Denmark. I get invited to play Dracula in a comedy musical in the Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen in Denmark. Now, every actor wants to play Dracula, right? If for no other reason than you'll be able to say in Bela Lugosi's Deathless Transylvanian, good evening. I turned up in Copenhagen, and as the Hashgacha would have it, they gave me an apartment to share with the guitar player in the band, who just happened to be a Jewish boy from Manchester. So I go over to this apartment, and I didn't know he was Jewish, he didn't know I was Jewish. So I realized about 2 minutes into our conversation, he's bageling me. You know what bageling means? Bageling? That's a great expression. Bageling is what happens when 2 secular Jews meet, right? And neither's quite sure whether the other one's Jewish or not. So they kind of drop into the conversation a Yiddish word here, or they're like oy vey or gewaldig, to just see what the reaction is. So I realized he was bageling me. So I said to him, are you Jewish? He said, yes. He said, are you Jewish? I said, yeah. I said, you don't look very Jewish. He said, well, you don't look very Jewish either. So well, anyway, after this not terribly promising start to our friendship, we got on very well. And in the course of this conversation, he said to me, you know something, there's a beautiful shul here in Copenhagen. Why don't we go down there next Saturday morning? It'll be a laugh. So I said, okay, all right, and why not? So next Shabbos morning at the bright and early hour of about 11:30, we trooped down to this shul, and this beautiful shul. I'm sitting there and I'm taking in all this beautiful architecture. I realized that the shamus is making a beeline towards me. Now, this guy's a very impressive looking fellow. He's got this long coat on, this flat Flemish painter's cap, and in his hand is this velvet cushion on which there's this silver ingot, a silver plate with the Hebrew inscription. And he walks over to me with tremendous aplomb, and he proffers it to me, and I pick up this silver plate, and I think to myself, wow, this is really nice. The first time you come here, they give you a present. This Danish fellow sitting next to me says, He's calling you up. He's giving you an aliyah. He's giving me an aliyah. He's giving me an aliyah. I'm 36 years old. This is my first aliyah since my bar mitzvah. How long is that? It's 23 years since my last aliyah, and I'm going to have to go up there, and I'm going to have to say the brachas. That's right, there are brachas. There are brachas before, and there are brachas after. I start to flip through the siddur to try and find my lines. Well, I go up there, I have my aliyah without making too much of a fool of myself, and I sit down and I think to myself, this is really nice. This is nice. I like this. As I'm lost in this reverie, the Danish fellow sitting next to me turns to me and says, would you like to come for Shabbos? So I say, yes, I think I would. I think I would. And he leads me back through the streets of Copenhagen, which I can promise you are far from being Ir HaKodesh. But maybe you know something, for the few minutes that we walked together, where there was a bit of the same feeling. When you're keeping Shabbos in a place where nobody else is, it's like you're in this amazing Shabbos bubble. It's like you're in a different world. And he led me into his home. And two things struck me immediately as I walked through the front door of this man's home. Two things are conspicuous in a traditional Jewish home. By traditional, I do not mean bagels and lox. I mean the way the Jewish people have been doing things for the last 3,000 odd years. Two things are conspicuous in a traditional Jewish home. One's conspicuous by its presence, and the other is conspicuous by its absence. What is conspicuous in a traditional Jewish home by its presence? Sfarim, books. Books. I'd never seen a room so full of books in my life. I looked at that wall of books and I thought, you're such a wise guy with your Rocky Horror Picture Show and your Foreigner and your platinum albums, so that's your world and you can't read a word of it. And I was filled with a tremendous sense of my own ignorance. I think it was Muhammad of all people who called us the people of the book. The problem is that most of us can't read it anymore. And by reading it, I don't mean, getting into a taxi cab and being able to say a few words in Ivrit modern at Kane, Ani mi ha'atzot Brit. And I don't mean having some kind of ridiculous bar mitzvah ceremony out there in the Hamptons and getting, 300 iPhones for your pains. I mean understanding what's pshat, what was the secret that was locked into those books, those hundreds and those thousands of years ago. And I looked at that wall of books and I was filled with a tremendous sense of loss. And I didn't even know what it was that I'd lost. That's what's conspicuous in a traditional Jewish home by its presence. While we're on the subject, what is conspicuous in a traditional Jewish home by its absence? TV. I don't think the two things are unconnected. I'm sure none of you have televisions yourselves, and of course none of you have iPhones. But next time you walk into a room where people are watching the television, do yourself a favor. Don't watch the television. Turn around and watch the people watching the television. You'll see something like this. Now, take that picture. Take that picture, and we're going to leave aside any discussion as to content. Let's just talk about form. Let's talk about the way ideas are transferred. Take that picture and compare that with what goes on in a base medrash. The first time I walked into a base medrash, I was scared out of my life. I thought people were going to strangle each other, and the thumbs are flying, and the engagement, a person has to seriously think, what is going on with what's left of my brain when I spend so many hours in this passivity, fed information, now this, now that, now that. Okay, this is a big subject. We don't have time to go into it now, but it's something to consider. I went into the Shabbos table, as I said. I was sitting there. I went for this Shabbos meal, and we talked a lot about Hanukkah. It was the week before Hanukkah. And I thought, this year I want to light a menorah. Walked out in the street after the meal. It started to snow. And I was walking around, and everybody around me looked very suddenly foreign. Very tall, very blonde, very blue-eyed, very Danish. So I went down to the Jewish shop in Copenhagen, which has everything. It's a one-stop for everything Jewish. And I bought myself a little brass menorah, and I put it into the window. And I started to light my candles. I'm lighting candles. I'm lighting candles. Now, get this picture, because, in Copenhagen, it's very near the Arctic Circle. It gets dark in Copenhagen about 3:30 in the afternoon at this time of the year. It's a very dark, very northerly place. What is the word in Hebrew for north? Tzafon. Tzafon is the same as another word in Hebrew, exactly the same word. Tzafun. Tzafun means concealed, hidden. Because Chazal teaches that the north is a place of concealment, of darkness. And it's at that time, in the darkest time, where the light starts to burst forth. There's a little Pintel Yid who wants to start lighting candles. In the north place, the darkest place. And I'm thinking as I'm talking to you now, that situation of Klal Yisrael, it looks like we're going to go into a very dark period. Hashem should have rachamim on us. But remember that the light always comes, when the darkness is deepest. When the dark can't get any darker, that's when the light comes forth. So there I am, this little Pintel Yid, lighting my candles. But I have to get up from my candles because I've got to go downtown to the theater, that most Greek of Greek inventions. I'll tell you a little anecdote. Actors, as I said before, get very bored when they have to do the same thing every night. The same thing over. So what they do is they put the little pieces of what we call shtick, like it's a Yiddish word, like little things that's not in the script, just to kind of wake up the other actors to see, like I'm going to throw you a fastball, a curveball, catch this one. So there's a part, like as you know, the well-known that Dracula is repelled by the cross, right? So there was a point in where the guitar player used to pick up this cross and he used to sort of brandish it in my face. I was Dracula, right? And I used to go like, all this kind of stuff. And one afternoon, he changed the cross for a wooden Mogen David, Star of David. And I didn't know this. So he pulled this thing out, and he went like this, and it just collapsed all over the stage. Of course, the audience had no idea what was going on. I lit my 8th candle on that particular Hanukkah on a very stormy North Sea crossing on the ferry going back to England. I get back to London, I say to my father, Shalom, Daddy, where are my tefillin? He says, where are your tefillin? You haven't put on tefillin since the day after your bar mitzvah boy. I said, Daddy, you know something? I'd like some tefillin. So my father, Sadal Livrocha, said, come on then, let's go down to Golders Green. And he bought me some tefillin. Now what do you do when you have tefillin? You don't leave them in the bag, you put them on that day. You put them on. So I put them on that day, the day after that. I get a call from my agent back in New York. She says, come back to New York immediately. I've got a part I want you to audition for. Find yourself an apartment. I pick up the phone, and with one phone call, I managed to find myself an apartment which is half a block from the nearest Orthodox shul in Manhattan. And after that, it's like a midbar for about 25 blocks in every direction. So I turn up there the first Shabbos, and the rabbi realizes he has in me what we would call in England a likely lad. He sees I'm dead keen. So he says, why don't you come to shul during the week as well? I say, people go to shul during the week as well? I didn't know that. So he says, sure. So I turn up there, I think it's one Monday morning, and I've got my linear siddur there all prepared, and everything's going fine, and I can pretty much follow along. And then something really bizarre happens. Everybody does this. Of course, I'd never seen that before. They were saying Tachanun, and I'd only been to shul on Shabbos. If that wasn't strange, something even more weird happened. When the davening was finished, they opened up the bar. There's whiskey, there's bourbon, there's gin. This is 7:45 in the morning. Now, of course, unbeknownst to me, this is what we call a tikkun, which is basically amongst certain communities, there's an idea that on the yahrzeit of a family member, lo aleinu, who passes away, so on that yahrzeit that we bring into shul some whiskey or some schnapps, some herrings, some kugel, and there's very deep mystical sources in this idea. Because when we make the brachas on the food, on the wine, on the schnapps, whatever it is, the neshama of the departed one has an aliyah in Shemaim. Literally the soul goes up. Of course, I didn't know anything about aliyahs in Shemaim. I just saw a booze up at 7:45 in the morning. So I'm, sort of somewhat nonplussed by this. The rabbi sees that I'm rather... So he walks over to me with this very large scotch. He says, "You're an actor. Actors drink." So purely out of politeness, I take the scotch from the rabbi, and then he gives me an even bigger scotch. About 7:55, I stagger out of this shul and I say, "This is great. I'm going back tomorrow." Well, I go back there the following day and they've closed the bar. But of course, by this time, the rabbi now has me exactly where he wants me. He says, "Look, you see what this minyan is like? This was a very, very shvacha minyan, a very weak minyan. You always know when you're davening in a weak minyan when you're the only person not saying Kaddish. That is except for these hobos that they've kind of wheeled off the street to make up the minyan. Now, nobody's quite sure whether these guys are Jewish or not, but they're delighted to get off the frozen New York sidewalk and get a hot cup of coffee and a jelly donut. And my friends, this was the minyan. It was Makarev me, which is an amazing thing. Because, if there's such a thing as the Guinness Book of the world's worst Kiruv Minyanim, this must have been minyan number 2. Nobody in their right mind would have thought of sending somebody to such a place to get them more interested in becoming more religious. And yet, for me it was perfect. Because if you'd sent me to the Upper West Side or wherever, where they have these, these Kiruv Minyanim, where they announce the page in English about 3 times a minute, I said, please. This minyan was very unthreatening. It was very, very Hamish. So anyway, this is the minyan that I'm davening in, and I'm davening Shacharis there every morning. And then about a few weeks later, I get this phone call. It's about 5 minutes to Shkia. And the rabbi says, "Quickly, can you come down? We need a 10th man for Mincha Ma'ariv at center." I go downstairs. We daven Mincha Ma'ariv. I realize after we've daven Mincha Ma'ariv why it is that they call it Mincha Ma'ariv, because that's about the length of time it takes them to daven both of them. After we finished davening Mincha Ma'ariv, the rabbi says to me, you have to come every day. You see what this minyan's like. I mean, it's very shvachi. So I said, okay. So there I am. I'm living in New York City. I'm trying to keep the mitzvahs. I'm davening 3 times a day. Well, at least twice. I'm keeping kosher. I'm keeping Shabbos. But I feel this. I don't know why I'm doing these things. Anyway, before I can really put all these thoughts together, I get invited down to Baltimore to do a play, a one-man show. In Baltimore, I find the identical minyan that I'd left in New York City. Only the names have been changed to protect the innocent. This was a part of Baltimore that was once a thriving Jewish community. All the Jews have now moved out, except the last 8 elderly Jewish gentlemen, and these guys are not leaving for anybody. If you want them out, you're going to have to truck them out of there. Now, every Sunday morning, they have this thing called the breakfast minyan. The breakfast minyan consists of about 25 minutes of shacharis and 2.5 hours of breakfast. And at these breakfasts, they have these conversations which you can honestly believe have been repeated verbatim for the last 35 years. The whole thing sounds like a tape recording. And I'm sitting there and I hear this conversation, and it was this, finally, which brought me to Eretz Yisrael, this following conversation. And it went something like this. I always wanted to go to Israel. Yeah? So why don't you go? I'm waiting. Yeah? What are you waiting for? I'm waiting till it's too late. I hear this and I think to myself, I'm not waiting till it's too late. I finish up the show, I go back to New York, pack up my stuff, get on a plane, I fly to Eretz Yisrael, I take a taxi up to Yerushalayim, and I sit down at a place called Or Samech, and nearly 40 years later, as they say, the rest is history. I once asked somebody, why me? If you'd taken a photograph of me back there in the day, and you say, one of these guys is going to become frum, he's going to become a rabbi in Yerushalayim, and he's going to have a beautiful family, Bli Anhara, and which one is it? I promise you, I would be the last person in that group on that photograph you'd have chosen. I once asked somebody, why me? So the answer I got was, it could be that you had schus avos. Schus avos means the merit of the fathers. It means somebody must have davened very hard somewhere in your past. Maybe you know who they are. A grandfather, a Zayda, a Bubba, an Elta Zayda. You've been given a ticket. And girls, I want to say this to you as well. We've all been given a ticket to come to Yerushalayim, to imbibe, to drink in the Kedusha of the city. And all that's available here, all the knowledge, all the Kedusha, all the closeness to Hashem that's here. We've been given a ticket. Like anything though, the ticket gets you in the door. What you do with that is up to you. That's where your Bechira comes in. I don't know how long your program is here, but I give you a bracha that you should take every single moment that you're here and use it. Use it, find out, grow as much as you can. This is such a wonderful opportunity. Most of you will probably have to go back to the States, and I don't have to tell you, it's a very different world here. You're really living in a kind of Gan Eden here, and everything is accessible, everything is available, all the Kedusha is there just waiting for you. I beg you, don't waste your time. You know, there's so many things that, nowadays even more so many machines that take a person away from himself. It's so easy to waste your time, so easy to waste your time. Don't waste your time. Every second you're here is golden. You've been a wonderful audience, and I thank you for your attention. Chanukah Sameach.